the Hitchhiker's Way podcast. Today we have the founder of Netlify, Matthias Billman, in the podcast, and it's a really great. I'm really grateful to have you in the podcast, Matthias. How's it going?
All good, all good. Never a dull moment.
There's a lot to do. Even I think Netlify is doing well now, and it is in Series D, right? When was your last round?
Last round was right at the very end of 21, a Series D round. And yeah, in March next year, it'll be like the 10-year anniversary of when we went out of private beta. So it's been a moment, and it's come a long way from when it was just me writing all the code.
Amazing.
Doing everything.
So I just want to kick off the podcast with your origin story. So that's from your childhood. Like, how did it actually affect your work ethic right now? How did your childhood shape how you are right now as a founder? Was there something like that?
I guess it shapes everything about who you are to some degree, right? Like, I'm from Denmark and up in a suburb of Copenhagen, right next to Moor, which spend a lot of my time just running around with other kids on the streets of the neighborhood and in the moor doing our own thing and exploring and so on. When I was about 10 years old or so, I got my first computer. Back then it was like a Commodore 64, and just personal computers in general was a really new thing. But I convinced my parents to get me like a used Commodore 64 from someone as a gift, in part because my handwriting was so terrible that one of my teachers was like, hey, maybe if you get him one of these fancy new computer things, you'll like to start typing something legible. Who knows, right? Like, right from the beginning, I got very bitten by that idea of like a sort of weird world existing in that computer that you could do things that you could create, right? Like, even something as simple as like a little, probably one of the first programming tutorials was like a number guessing game, right? Like, guess a number and you type in and it's like it's higher, it's lower, and so on, right? Like, just that moment of understanding that you could somehow make this computer interact with the world and things show up on the screen and do stuff was just like pretty inherently magical. And I spent a lot of time with computers. At the same time, I grew up in a family that were very deep. Like, my mom was a teacher at the conservatory and a pianist. My dad, a radio producer and presenter in the Danish radio, making programs around like classical and contemporary classical music and so on. So it's like very deep into like the artistic and the humanities and the arts and so on, right? Like, and the whole family was sort of always looking at like, what's going to become of that little kid that's just spending all of his time in front of the computer, right? Like, what's going to happen with that? At the same time, I also started spending time with the piano and like read a lot and actually took like a path into the humanities. Took a bachelor in musicology and comparative literature and started a major in cultural studies while working as a freelance musical journalist. So all the way back from childhood, I think it was like a very creative-centered upbringing. I think I never grew up with a like sense of like, hey, I have to take this career path with like these steps and so on, right? I always just thought of figuring out my own path. My parents gave me a lot of encouragement and freedom to be curious and explore. So I got deep into computers and learned to sort of just like then figure out stuff on my own, right? Like, I think a lot of those experiences have shaped also who I am.
What was your first breakthrough into tech? Like, how did you make your first like money in tech?
So I did a lot of stuff. Didn't make any money for right? Like, I programmed a lot of things while I was always programming stuff, and I was often like, because I always just saw myself as self-taught, I always just thought there were these professional programmers out there that really knew what they were doing, and I should just do stuff for free. But like, so I would just like help out some guy in the US that were building like a network of gaming sites and needed them to all be coordinated, and built like a SOAP messaging layer between them that connected all of them and like allowed for publishing across multiple channels and so on. but just for free because I thought it was like fun and like an interesting problem to solve, right? Like, and then at a point, I mean, I would say even as my time as a musical journalist, I did also do some things on the actual web technology of the Danish radio that like, it was not like I was paid to be a developer or anything, but I ended up doing some stuff there around some specific projects, right? Like, but I was never like seeing myself as that until I moved to Spain. So I met a girl from Spain and it went to visit, she visited, I went a bit there, and I decided, okay, I'm going to go to Spain for at least 3 months and finish up my master's thesis in cultural studies. And then kind of realized, okay, I'm going to end up staying for a lot more than 3 months. And the market for writing about music in Danish in Madrid in Spain is very limited. It's like, okay, I might need to find out a plan B. Started just building stuff. So I built like one of the first things I built was this like Sudoku challenge where it's just like a website where you would go in, you would get a Sudoku, it would time how fast you solved it, and then you could put in an email address of a friend. That friend would get the same Sudoku, and once the friend was done, you would see like who did it fastest, and I put some AdWords on and earned some cents on that, and not anymore. Started building out like this browser-based space game where I found like an old scientific paper from the 70s about formation of planetary systems by accretion and how you could simulate that on a supercomputer, and found out that, okay, modern computers could just run that whole simulation during a web request. So I could like come up with a way to like generate all of these solar systems and build this Flash-based UI where you could travel from planet to planet and so on. And before I really finished it, I showed it to some people, and I got hired as a developer on for a Denver-based startup that were building like a social networking site at the time. Right at this time where like Facebook had just come out of universities, and there was like a lot of like people were either building social networking or mobile games. So got my first kind of paid role there, though to be fair, it was mainly paid in stock options that never turned out to be worth anything. But it was like the first sort of real, okay, wow, now I'm sort of doing this. And then ran into some people in Spain that was building a really interesting company. Like it was a startup that they were doing a lot of different things, right? Like, so like running the largest hostel booking site in Spain, the second largest social media site in Spain, but the core business was really like delivering websites to small to medium businesses at a very large scale. So at our peak, we would end up being building like 100 websites a week, right? Like, I ran into those and showed them what I built and so on, and they recruited me to come work as a Ruby on Rails developer. And it was actually like my first actual paid salary job was as a senior Ruby on Rails developer. So, and I remember sitting there the first days and just like, I thought it was really fun to just like build this stuff. And it was like, when are they going to figure out I'm just sitting here and having fun? Like, somehow within a couple of years went from being a Ruby on Rails developer to tech lead and the team I've done to director of technology and then CTO of the company. And then right at the start of 2010, like to power this business, we had built several iterations of an internal platform that allowed like the designers to do the design work, the content editors, like the customers to do CMS, content editing and so on, and that powered every single website from the first initial brief and all the way to production hosting, running like an infrastructure for tens of thousands of websites, right? Like, so right at the start of 2010, we kicked off a spin-off where I started a startup together with the founders of that company to build like a cloud-hosted multi-tenant CMS and take the experience of having built that kind of technology in-house and make it available to like other developers and agencies and professionals and so on. And that sort of became the first real company I was part of starting.
So from there, how did you like go to Netlify?
Yeah, so right when we started Webpop, Julio, my co-founder there, who is now founder of Domestic, like there was another project that kind of came out at the same time, but it's like one of the largest education platform for creatives in the Spanish-speaking world. we went just when we started Webpop together. He went on a tour with the Spanish Chambers of Commerce to see like the Bay Area, San Francisco, and like this whole Silicon Valley ecosystem, and went and visited a bunch of startups, VCs, and got sort of that tour, and came back from that, and it was like he went straight from the airport to me. It's like, Matthias, we have to go to San Francisco. And it was not something I had considered all at the time, so I was just like, that sounds really interesting. And he was like, just get 3 months ESTA, go there, work from there for 3 months, and then come back and tell me if we should go. And I did that. I came back and told him, yeah, we should absolutely go. So
what made you think that San Francisco is the one that you were like, yeah?
I mean, there were so many different things, right? Like, the first is like when you're actually building tooling for developers and builders, there's just no other place where you get the same concentration of that ecosystem, right? Like the meetups that happens, the events that happens, just the access you get to people who are developing and building and sharing what they're doing, and that you can get in front of and get feedback from. There's the whole funding ecosystem that also means that there's like a cycle of both angel investors and VCs that will put money into ideas and into builders, and it's a very different funding ecosystem than in Europe, where Europe tends to be much more short-term sort of profit focused on like, hey, give me your 4-year business plan with the numbers. The Silicon Valley mentality is much more outcome focused in terms of like, how are you really going to build something that changes the world or have a big impact and different in your idea, and where's your vision at, and how big can you make that, right? Like, there was also a sense of optimism that reflected that, where in general in Europe people will be more prone to think about all the things that wouldn't work if you did something, and in the Bay Area there's more of a mentality of like, okay, but what if it really worked? How big could it be? What more could you do, right? Like, and I love that. Plus, it's a very approachable ecosystem, right? Like, it's very easy to reach out to someone and be like, hey, can I grab a coffee, or can I get you on a podcast or something, right? Like in a way that maybe doesn't exist anywhere else. So I found that very, very inspiring, and really wanted to find a way to be
so you called your friend and you told that we have to move to San Francisco to work there, and then what happened?
So we worked here and kept working on Webpop. Got it to a certain size, had some pretty cool paying customers like the Guardian, United Healthcare, and so on, but it wasn't like a runaway success. It was really technically, I'm very proud of like what we built. We had like serverless functions in JavaScript in 2010, right? Like, it was like in some ways ahead of its time. But I also started really, like, while working on that, I was sort of really starting to think the way people are building for the web is actually probably fundamentally needs to change. Like, so Webpop was like a traditional monolithic CMS that included both like the templating UI layer of how you build and design, as well as the content management layer that decides like what's your content model and content structure and so on, right? Like, and that ran all of that together, and that was kind of just the way you would, like, we traditionally always did things, and that any other CMS, whether it was cloud hosted or non-cloud hosted, would be doing thing, and the same with like all the e-commerce platforms and application platforms. And I started building this clear belief that there was like such a different speed to the evolution of all of the technologies for building the actual web experiences, all the front-end tooling and all the tooling emerging around JavaScript, and all the abilities you suddenly had in the browser to just call different APIs directly from a browser that hadn't existed before that. That I really built a belief that like the fundamental model of this monolithic CMS was going to end up getting outdated by the market, and that we kind of really needed a path to like build, like to decouple the web experience layer completely from the business logic layer and the content layer and the transaction layer and so on. And that a lot of those pieces, like content, would turn into headless APIs, and e-commerce would turn into this API services, search would turn into API services. And I was seeing like the very early of that emerging, right? Like, this was like 2013, where Contentful raised their first little seed round as a Berlin company, right? Like there was like the first trickles going on, right? Like, and I could see that no one was really thinking about like what do we do with the actual hit in that hitless world, right? Like what's the path to building there? And got pretty convinced that was where the biggest opportunity for me was. So I built like a small prototype around the infrastructure I already had. It's called BitBalloon and put it out in the wild that just allowed people to get front-end code on a URL almost instantly, right? Like that was just the goal. Like how fast can I make that process, right? Like the first was just like a website, bitballoon.com, where you could just like drag a front end onto the site and you would get a URL, right? Like just to really think like what's the fastest I can make it. And started just getting signal that this resonated with the market, that this proposition of this directness of taking all on these intermediary steps was there. And I started really thinking through, okay, what's the whole sort of flow through GitHub and CI/CD and so on that people go through to publish and iterate. And then I started talking to one of my best friends back from Denmark, Chris, who I'd gone to high school with, and we'd gone to a lot of jazz concert and played a lot of computer games and so on. But meanwhile, I had moved to Spain and taken that whole career turn into technology, and he had stayed in Denmark but built his own digital production company in the era of sort of Flash experience side and digital experiences, and had then sold that and became a chief digital officer and partner at a large sort of full agency. And I just started talking a lot to him about this whole shift in the architecture of the web that I thought was both needed and was going to happen, right? Like, and we started really seriously talking about, okay, if we want to trigger that whole shift, if we want to make it really simple to build like modern sites, web apps, web stores at scale, what's the full tool chain that we need to give, and how do we give it a name? How do we build an ecosystem around it? And invited him to come have some red wine in California, and talked about that, and along that path I got him convinced to like quit his well-paying job back in Denmark and come with his family to one of the most expensive cities in the world and stop having a salary and like just start building this. We came up with the name Netlify and then launched the first version of Netlify in March 2015. Just the two of us.
Having that, you've actually worked on Netlify before when the market was still growing, right? So if you were to start a company right now,
yeah.
What would be the 3 or 4 internal gut checks that you have inside, like hypothetically?
Yeah, I mean, if I were to start something completely new now, I mean, obviously it would be very different doing it as after having taken the company to the scale we're at now at Netlify and doing it over again and having built more of a network, right? Like also back then we were like 2 Danes in San Francisco, no network, no anything, right? Like we just had to prove we could build something that people care about and then see what would happen, right? Like, but I would honestly still try to tap into that. I would still try to be pretty minimal on like resources and anything in the beginning. I would try to build out a market thesis of like over the next 5 years, what is the big things I expect to change that will open up a possibility for some little new startup to build something that's suddenly relevant in a way that a big company won't just be doing, because it's like taking advantage of a changing wave, and you can start at a small point there that's just not relevant for the big companies and then ride that wave into becoming big, right? Like, so it really start with like, what's my core of what's different for the market and where's there a real problem to solve? And then I would try to find like the most concrete, smallest problem to start with that if that thesis is right, should add some value immediately. And I would just try to get that in front of real customers as fast as possible, right? Like, and be really good at understanding that everybody, like when you get something in front of customers, everybody will say nice things to you because they're nice people. But unless they also go away and start using what you showed them, doesn't matter what they say. Like, it's just nice words, right? Like,
wrong kind of
you
validation.
gotta really center on the reasons that you show something. You gotta, like, it's so easy to get all of the validation from just people saying, oh, that's awesome, I love it, it's great, and so on, right? Like, but if they try it out, one, if you can't get them to try it out, there's like, then there's like a really fundamental thing. And if they try it out and it's like this is awesome, but they don't come back and use it again, then that's a signal you need to listen to, and that's where you have to start figuring out, okay, what does it take to get that to click with a set of users where when you try it, like when you get it in front of them, whatever it takes to get it in front of them, right? Like when you get it in front of them and they try it out, they actually start using it to a reasonable degree, right? Like getting that initial cycle going is so key. And then being able to tie it to something bigger, right? Like to some bigger motion that means that there's a way that you can go from this small group of people seeing your product, using it, to potentially building something really large. That would be a key piece.
So speaking about customers, like what was that one insight that drove like first 20 to 30 customers for Netlify? And explain how you found that insight during the iterations you did in the early stage.
In really early stage, it was very much about that like instantaneous path to getting something on a domain in a scalable way, and then being able to iterate it fast, right? Like, so it's really about obsessing around how fast I could make that cycle, and how targeted to like front-end developers I could make it feel, right? Like, and that sort of organically, even before Netlify, I put up Bitballoon, I just put like a per site on it for adding a custom domain, and I organically started just getting the first small payments, right? Like $7 a month, I think was like the price, or like $9 a month to $7 if you paid annually, right? Like, so immediately started just getting some uptick of people that just like put a site on, put a custom domain. It was like, wow, this is so fast that I'll like, why not pay for this, right? Like, started getting feedback there, and then started just sort of really building content and community. And when Chris joined, like, we were really focused on like thinking through that in developer tools, there's sort of a very specific way that tools spread in concentric circles from like very early adopters, open source builders, and so on. People that sort of follow them, see the influence from there, people that are like visible in the community, that share what they're doing, and then the sort of more regular developers. Like, so we were really focused on like who's the core people in the development community and in the space of building web experiences that we should find some way of getting in front of. And can we get, like, do we have the right product where at least half of those, if we just one way or the other come in front of it, genuinely excited about it, right? Like, and either start using it or start sharing it and so on, right? Like, so we were just really focused on that group of like essentially like 20 people and companies or something at first, right? Like, and just like, how do we get them to know about us, right? Like, then once they started sort of using it and spreading the word and so on, right? Like, then it was all about like building content marketing and building into like a story of like, where does this fit in the whole ecosystem. At a point we coined the term Jamstack, right? Like, to also just see that like was a lot of things going on around this new way of building, from static site generators to progressive web apps to single page applications to like API economy and so on. But we needed to be able to have like one term to describe this fundamental like decoupling and new way of building the front end that people could just lean into and feel part of, right? Like, so we started coining that and bringing people into that and driving content around that, right? Like, all very scrappy and guerrilla.
So you told about building communities and creating content that really educates people about your product, right? So for founders building products where they have to have communities and they have to go through the same process of creating content to educate their customers, how do you like recommend building communities when they're in their early stage?
Yeah, again, don't think about like several things. Look at other companies that have been successful in doing it, but don't look at where they are now, at what they did when they were where you are, right? Like, so look at what they did really early on, not what they did later on. It's easy to go look and copy like what a cool developer startup is doing right now, but you should figure out, okay, they're doing that because they are already like have the community and they're probably starting to monetize and they have a lot of other concerns, right? Like go back and figure out what did they actually do when they were at your stage. And focus on this model of like communities built, especially when you're early on, right? Like you have very limited reach. So you have to focus on things that might not scale, but that touches the right kind of people in the community, right? Like you have to really figure out like who are the people that already have community around them that you can get involved and that you can get excited and that you can get to bring in their concentric circles and their communities, right? Like so be really targeted in that way and figure out what you have, like figure out what your value to the community is, right? Like especially when you think about content, right? Like you gotta, like ideally you want to really figure out where is it that we are doing something new and exciting, that because it's new and exciting that there's just not a lot of content around it already, there's not a lot of places to find information around it. Where's that cluster of like information that we can really be the ones that build the valuable content around, and don't treat it too much as like marketing content, and like really think about it as like building those hubs of information where your community can find the information that they can't find somewhere else, right? Like so think about what you're actually, how you're actually creating value for the community and where there is a gap that you can fill, and that'll help build it up, right? Like and just really care about it, like be really like just really care about everyone in the community, know who they are, and like and value them. That's
Awesome.
important piece.
So Netlify has been selling to business. During the early stage, were you selling to businesses or developers?
And we were always like, between me and Chris, we always had this saying, like if we had some magic button we can click where developers would never have to pay anything for anything they just built for themselves, but businesses would always have to pay for things they built for themselves, we would press it. There isn't really, like, you gotta find some other pricing maneuvers that like mimics that a bit, right? Like, but we always had that vision, right? Like, but we've always had this kind of like bottom up funnel, right? Like where at first it was really just developers coming in, putting something live and clicking publish, or agencies coming in, just building stuff for clients and putting in a credit card. Pretty early on, we started getting the first like cases where especially an agency might be working on something for a slightly larger customer, that customer like more of a formal contract and like guarantees and so on, right? Like, so even when we were just two people, we started like making our first kind of in contracts, right? Like maybe at around $1,000 a month, yearly paid with like a proper service contract. So we started doing that mixture fairly early on, right? Like, and then gradually evolved. Like just before our Series A, we had brought in the first full-time salesperson that was just trying to figure out that initial, like, how do we actually sell larger contracts into the larger companies that are starting to touch our platform and use our platform, and sort of figure out like what does it take to get one of them to get to a 6-figure deal and so on, right? Like, and then after we raised the Series A, got to Series B stage, it really became around like how do we start making those kind of 6-figure deals more repeatable and structured and build sales team around it, right? Like, and then as you get further down, you start learning more about like how your motion work and what you got to do, and have sort of like started building out later on like the real enterprise selling motion that's very different from a project, from a tool like ours that in the end it's also in like the mission critical path for these businesses, right? Like if you go to one of our large customers' properties, right, like they run directly on our network, and requires like us to be always up and always responsive, right? Like, so selling into those is like, when that's a big company with like, this can be companies that are pushing $500 million of revenue through their web properties, right? Like there, it's not a decision where like a web developer goes in and it's like, oh, can we point the domain name over here, right? Like there, it's like a very involved buying decisions with where they really need to know they have a true partner on the other side, and where you have to do a different kind of work to establish that partnership and sell into them, right? Like, and this keeps evolving. It never ends in the journey of building these.
So, how would you advise founders to sell for B2B right now?
It's hard to give a really generic advice, right? Like, because it depends so much what you're selling, right? Like, and how you have to take it to market, right? Like, sometimes I've had founders come to me and ask, like, how do I build like a bottom up motion and so on, and I look at their product and it's like, I don't think it's a bottom up product you're building, right? Like, I think you have to start from the other end, and on the flip side, like the market right now in SaaS, with like pretty much every company over the last years have been like very strictly starting to looking at SaaS spend as something they want to drive down, right? Like, I think there was a period where most companies were much more focused on overall growth and just like accelerating growth, and where they would bring in a lot of SaaS tools for that, right? And now we're definitely in a period of tightening because of higher interest rates, where companies are really focused on like every tool we have gotta know that the money we spend there are either saving us money somewhere else or measurably like generating uplift for our business in one of the areas the CFO cares about, or ideally both, right? So I think that also changes a bit, like how you as a founder have to be really good at starting to articulate that, like where your tool can save cost for a business, where it can help them achieve revenue growth, right? In an earlier area, it was maybe enough to get the direct users just excited and get them to like virally adopt it, and at some point someone would sign off. That's gotten much harder, right? Like, you typically need to think more about that core business value proposition. But that doesn't mean that you should give up on like the bottom-up community building around it. In the end, it's still very, if you have users of your products that are real champions internally and like that really cares and feel that your product will help their work, right? Like, just gotta kind of add that level of clear return of investment thinking.
So, from what I heard, you told that you started selling in mixed, right? You started selling to businesses and developers and enterprise in the early stage. That I've heard founders and investors say that it's good to go to the SMBs first and then move to the enterprise. And how do you go about that? Was that sustainable when you were doing all sorts of things at one time?
In a broad scope of things, we definitely went from like smaller and smaller into mid-market, where our early enterprise deals were still more mid-market, right? Like, and then took much later to get into big enterprises. But we did get into parts of them pretty early, right? Like, I would say that it depends so much on the scope of what you're selling, right? Like, early on, when we were selling into really large enterprises, it would just typically be on a very specific per project basis and so on, right? Like, later on, we're much more in the like, how do we take care of your core web properties and your actual strategy, right? Like, and that we wouldn't have been able to do early on, right? Like, we even had like some big opportunities early on where some architect from like a massive enterprise consumer goods company would reach out and be like, hey, what would it take for us to adopt something like that? I really believe it's the right architecture and so on, where we kind of had to decide, like, if we went and tried to do this now, it would take it would be all we would be doing, right? Like, we wouldn't be doing anything else. Like, we would just essentially be like a service company working for this big company, right? Like, because we were like 10 people or something in the whole company, right? Like, and they would have massive demand. So that was like a conscious decision back then. Like we can't, like, let's not go for that, right? Like, we gotta build the whole product we want. We gotta build into the market vision we have, and not just like not get consumed by one single customer, right? Like, so I think in general that advice is true in the sense of like, if you're really servicing big customers very early on, there is a big risk that you become more of a service than a SaaS company.
You lose your core principles.
And lose control over your product roadmap, right? Like, in terms of like being proactively building towards a vision and building into a company. That said, that there's definitely also examples of that being a really successful strategy, right? Like, I think especially for founders that very deep experience in those enterprise companies themselves and can go out and have identified like a core set of needs that exist about multiple of them, and can sort of go out and start solving those and selling very top down and so on, right? Like that's a very powerful way to build a business, right? Like, but you got to really have that experience and those relations and so on for that to be successful. And otherwise, I think it's much more common to gradually move up market, right?
So, what do you think worked in your case? Like you were doing mixed, right?
I mean, we were doing mixed, but we were doing all inbound in the beginning, which is the difference, right? Like I think when you really go after enterprise, you start really building outbound and building more of a relationship, right? Like I think our model was more similar to you could look at companies like Github or Atlassian or so on that's been even more successful, right? Like and are big like that are definitely also where we aspire to develop towards, right? Like but that very much build inbound models as first, right? Like meaning that the product drives all the leads and you will sell into whoever comes, right? Like it doesn't matter if they're an SMB or if they're an enterprise, you will sell to them, but you're not really engaging in these like really long demanding sales cycles where you're also kind of committing like a level of support and engagement that you probably just can't deliver on as a very early stage company, right? Like, and then there will be a time where that's actually like, it's been hard for us. We've definitely made mistakes in the process, but like figuring it out, right? Like where you have to start layering on a real actual enterprise sales motion on top of that inbound motions. And those two motions, like the reason it's hard is that they're very different, right? Like, and you don't want to do that before you can do it, I would say, right? Like, but you will typically also, in most cases, you will have a level where the pure inbound motion will only carry you so far in terms of growth and especially in terms of upmarket.
So I have a follow-up question for this. Like when you serve to a broad customer base in the beginning, you might have a lot of customers having a lot of requests, right, which are quite different. Like how would you, sometimes most users are good at finding problems, but they're not good at suggesting solutions. That is a work of the founder, right? So how do you differentiate between building a good feature request versus ignoring bad ones?
Yeah, I wish I had a really simple answer to that. It's very hard, right? Like, and it's even harder, I think, sometimes as a platform company where there's even like layer in between where an enterprise customer might ask to do something very specific, but the really great way where we can really make a difference by solving is building some core platform primitive that makes it possible to solve that problem, but a lot of other problems as well, right?
It's system.
And that's hard to build like a simple recipe for, right? Like I think you need product people. As a founder, you're one of them, right? Like that have deep product, like they really understand your product in depth and in the details and in the weeds, that can listen to customers and really understands their problems, but can look beyond the features the customers are using, like are asking for, and really think, okay, but more fundamentally, like why are they asking for that feature and what can we do to solve that problem rather than how do we build that feature. And it's very easy to get into that kind of like feature factory loop where your SEs and your customers and your partners are saying like, hey, we need this feature and we need that feature, and suddenly you're sort of tied up in just building those features. But the real magic happens when you can take a step back from that and really abstract away from, okay, but what's the, like, don't tell me the feature you need, like tell me what's the pain you're having, right? Like what's the problem you're running into, what's the outcome you need to solve for, and let us also apply our creativity to like how could our product potentially solve that problem maybe in a different way that you've imagined.
So you shouldn't.
It's hard to find.
So you shouldn't build the feature in the beginning, and you have to think about the core need and why the customer is thinking like that before, and then validate the feature and build it out.
Yeah. You should really try to get a real understanding.
Motivation.
Of like how are they doing things now? What are the pain points, and how can you make those pain points go away and not just listening to like, we need this feature. You need to solve for an outcome, not for a feature, right? Like, it's also another recommendation when you ask about like the early stage founders and sort of the product market fit journey, that's so important in that stage, because it's so easy to be in a place where you keep feeling, okay, if I just add, like they're asking for these 2 more features, if I add those 2 more features, they'll start like really using the product, and these 3 more features, these 5 more. And when you're in that early product market fit stage, that never works. It's never like a few features, right? Like, it's really about understanding like what is the real impact you can drive, and what is like the real deeper pain you're having, and how can you come up with a solution that might not just be another feature, but that's like a holistic solution to what they're trying to actually accomplish, that will make a real difference to them, right? That kind of like, later on as you scale, you'll have to have some balance between, okay, of course you will have some features that are just like maybe not innovative and maybe just to neutralize competitors or catch up in areas where there's like, maybe you'll have some features that you should actually just solve in the most basic way possible, because they're just like a checklist item that needs to be there, but they're not moving forward, right? Like, and we'll have to dedicate some time to that ongoing work. But you need to keep being able to take those steps back and think like, okay, but in the broader of like, where is the pain in solving the problems our customers are trying to solve? What could our product potentially do to more fundamentally remove that pain, right? Like, that's always where the big shifts in value comes.
That's amazing. So, talking about selling to the B2B, have you found out the common pitfalls founders go through while marketing their tools, like especially when it comes to selling to businesses in the early stage? What are the common pitfalls that founders should avoid? Like, what kind of mistakes did you do in terms of marketing?
I mean, I've done so many of them all along the way, right? Like, and then also gotten some things right, and it changes a lot from the early stages to the later stages, right? Like, the first big thing in terms of marketing is just like that. There's this phrase from Steve Blank's book, I think it's called like the Startup Owner's Manual or something like that, where he describes like the biggest problem you have in the early stage is breaking through the wall of indifference of the market. And that's just to say that every like, as a founder, you're very obsessed about like the problem space and the tool and the technology area you're in. You know everything about it. You wake up and think about that every single day, right? Like, and it's easy to imagine that your customers are in the same space, and that they're constantly working, like looking at this and waking up and thinking about this. But realistically, they're just absolutely not, right? Like, they're not founders of tools in your space. They're doing all kinds of other things, and whatever you're doing is some small peripheral thing in their life, right? Like, so remembering difference in who you are and who you're talking to is really important, right? Like, and figuring out like, what do I need to do to break through just this general like indifference, where like people will look at this and be like, oh sure, that's interesting, but I've got like a million other things going on right now, right? That's kind of like the core problem that everything should be about early on. And there's different approaches to it. There's like finding the ones, like who is it actually that are closest to caring enough about it that they would be interesting. Where is that part of the community? And just like early on, it's probably really valuable to just focus on that part of the community that at least cares, right? Like, figure out where are they, where do they get their information from. Don't over-index. That also means that you might, as a founder early on, dream a lot about like, oh, if I just get the big TechCrunch story or the big like publicity or so, and it will solve things. But that will actually just help you reach a lot of people that probably really don't care about what you're doing, right? Like, early on, it's much more important to reach those people that actually care, which is often like smaller segment. They have places where they find information and so on, and kind of have to figure out how, like, those are the ones you should really market to at first, right? Like, to have a chance of finding enough people that cares that you can then build.
So you were building the company, and when did you feel the product market fit kicking in? From how many months or years did it take?
I mean, I will say that there was a clear feeling of like already when I put out BitBalloon, the predecessor, I could see that there was something real there, right? Like I very quickly got this sense that, okay, there's something tangible here where that like instantaneousness between code and a URL really resonates with a group of people, right? Like, so it wasn't so much like a clear, like, the PMF is there, now it's not. It was more like once I got that out, they had a real sense that, okay, here's something to build on, right? Like, and then it's just a question of expanding and growing it and so on, right? Like, and then there was obviously different milestones around the journey, right? Like, sort of the first bigger company to put something serious on it, or the first agency to start really leaning in and using it for multiple projects, or like the first reseller agreement, or the first fundraise, and the moment where like Smashing Magazine came on and said, like, we like launched their whole like front-end publication with Netlify, but also their e-commerce and the events page and job board and everything, and sort of really proved like how far you could go with this technology, and like the fundraise that followed from that, and like there's a lot of different milestones along the way, right? Like, but I think I knew pretty fast when I got BitBalloon into the world that there was something here that had some organic momentum around it, and that I could build.
So, talking about product market fit, you told that you already had this gut feeling that you had product market fit from the beginning. And after a while, did you like use numbers to measure it? Like, how did you measure product market fit after that?
Yeah, it's always been like different specific numbers we looked at, right? Like, but we tried to look a lot at like the early on. One number I looked a lot at for our part was like the amount of monthly deploys flowing through our system, since so much was about getting this kind of iteration speed, right? Like, so seeing just that number of deployments flowing through, going up month after month, was important. Obviously, like typical engagement numbers like signups and active developers were like were important. It's a pretty traditional ones, right? Like, and then at that point you need to start translating that into revenue numbers, right? Like in terms of pipeline and closed deals.
So you had product market fit, something was working from the beginning, and but you chose to bootstrap the whole company with your co-founder, and suddenly you started raising money, you started raising seed to grow, I presume. Why did you like? So my question was like, can you like narrate how the seed happened for Netlify? Like, what was the story? How did you get? You told you were an outsider and you didn't know anyone in the valley. Yeah.
We were pretty outsiders, right? Like, so it was also not so much that we like chose to bootstrap. It was just like the option we had, right? Like, it was just to like build this thing and prove that it was interesting, right? Like, and we got a lot of early rejections on like, this doesn't seem interesting. Why are you doing this? Like, this is never gonna make money. Plenty of those, right? Like, and just stubbornly carried on because we felt like, okay, we can feel there's something real here, right? Like. And the seed fundraise was definitely like the hardest of our fundraisers, and the first one. I would say first, as I said, we were really obsessed in the beginning of just these concentric circles of like, how do we get like the core people that we really feel should get this to get it, and a lot of those were like founders of similar tools in the space, and some of those were the first ones that then also told us, hey, when you raise a seed round, count me in, right? Like, there's people like Tom Preston Werner from Github with Cloud, and Adam Wiggins from HeavyBit, and so on. Yeah, go ahead.
Those were pretty amazing people. And how did you get introduced to Tom Preston? He just started, was through word of mouth, or he just started using your software?
We spent a while harassing him, you could say that. Seeing him tweet something relevant, like reaching out on Twitter and being like, hey, yeah, like, you should do it, like, wish we could show you what we're working on, this is so cool, and so on. And then doing that a couple of times, and finally getting like a tweet back saying, oh yeah, reach out to me an email, and then sending him an email and getting no reply, and then reaching out on Twitter again, and then reaching out an email again, and then a bit later, and like there was like we just kept that until like at some point we suddenly got a mail like, oh yeah, I've seen it a little in a while. Let's grab a beer, right? Like, and we went and had a few beers with him, and at the end of that conversation, he said like, yeah, when you're racing around, like I'm interested, right? Like, and then we had to go like then we sort of got a group of angels together there, and then tried to move up and get actual like VC investors on board, and just do a lot of mapping out who are all the people that anyone we know can give us intros to that we can get in front of. How do we structure it? How do we like get in front of one after the other? Like refining our pitch, getting a lot of like no's, learning what resonate, what didn't resonate, taking that back into the pitch and getting better at it, right? Like, and then at that point, suddenly going from like these things are very often very schizophrenic, where you go from like desperately trying to just get enough commitments to close around, and then suddenly someone comes in and like, oh, I want to. I'm in, I'll take most of it, and suddenly you're oversubscribed, and you have to go back to investors that you've like been begging to give you money and be like, oh, can you give me a little less money because like now I don't have room and so on, right? Like it was a tough process. I remember the day the money finally came in the bank, I have some old picture of Chris and me sitting with like some pint-sized mimosas and looking absolutely miserable because like it was such a grind. But also like that was a big milestone and allowed us to go actually higher in the first.
Amazing. So during the whole fundraising process, who was that one investor? Who were the investors that believed in you when nothing was working out? Like till Series D, yeah.
I mean, there's always like investors only believe in you if something is working out. To be fair, right? Like there got to be something that gets someone to say like, hey, I think this is really there, right? Like the founder angel investors are typically different in that they're not so much in the mindset of like a return of an investment and so on, and more in the mindset of is it something really cool you're building, right? Like, and is there something real there? But as soon as you're talking to any kind of VC fund, right? Like there has to be something that's working out well enough for them to think this is where we should allocate our capital, that like from our LPs and so on, right? Like so, I always have to in the end they're running a business and they have to take decisions from that business. But there was definitely people back then that took big bets on us, right? Like Daf from Ad.Inc. They were a tiny, pretty unknown fund, and when we got introduced to them, it was about like maybe writing us a 50K check or something like that, right? Like he went and said, like, I'm gonna write the biggest check our fund was ever written, and be sort of the lead investor in this round, right? Like there's a big jump, and then Bloomberg Beta were kind of the ones that came in and where we were talking about a 250K check and said like, okay, we want to put in $1 million. Like we think this is really, really interesting, right? Like so James and Roy there were really one. And then people like I mentioned, right? Like Tom Preston Werner, Adam Wiggins, Todd Morey, who had it at Prisman that Data founded, Stackbit. Those were some of the other sort of early believers.
Okay, so how do you define your life? Does it majorly influence? Does your work majorly influence your life? Like, what is your definition of life?
Oh yeah, like yeah. This is not a road. Like you're not taking this road and getting any kind of like 9-to-5 job out of it, right? Like it's a very full on. Like there's very little boundaries between your life and your work when you start this kind of business, right? Like especially when you go out to start a venture backed business and try to build something really big, right? Like it's very all consuming and it's very all in. It's very hard, right? Like it's pretty grueling work all the time, and as a founder you're mostly constantly dealing with things that are broken or on fire or not working or about to fall apart or that's threatening your whole business or anything, right? Like so it's a pretty like it's very intense, and you constantly have to learn, you constantly have to grow, and you will make plenty of mistakes along the way that you gotta own up to and move forward with, right? Like at the same time, it's also that's also what's there to like about it, right? Like you're constantly engaged in really hard problem solving. There's never like a routine of just doing the same and the same. It's always new challenges. It always feels like what you're doing can have very real impact, whatever direction it ends up being in, right? Like you're definitely in a role where what you do impacts both yourself, your company, and lots of people around you, right? Like, and you get to build something out of nothing, right? Like, and see that have real effect in the world. But it's hard. It's like a lot of people would definitely absolutely hate it, I'm sure, and then some people will strangely enough really really enjoy it.
Oh, awesome. So thanks for taking the time to do the podcast, Matthias. I'm so grateful for this.
Yeah, thank you. This is a really fun conversation, and